Let's jump right into this. We are looking at an absolutely incredible explainer today about how one tiny, completely overlooked clue literally rewrote the timeline of human history. We're talking about ancient open ocean crossings, lost human species, and a genetic map that shatters pretty much everything we thought we knew. It all kicks off with a single discovery that pushed human timelines back by tens of thousands of years.
5 to 6%. Seriously, just let that number sink in for a second. That is a staggering amount of Denisovan DNA living right now in the genome of Aboriginal Australians. It's actually one of the highest concentrations of this ancient DNA ever found in any living population, anywhere on Earth. But you know what's really wild? This massive revelation was hiding inside a tiny 0.6-gram lock of hair. It was cut from a young Aboriginal man way back in 1923 at a railway stop in Western Australia, and then it just sat in a dusty box at Cambridge University for nearly 90 years. When scientists finally sequenced it in 2011, they weren't just reading modern DNA. No, they were suddenly looking at a chapter of human history that was 65,000 years old.
So obviously that brings up a pretty massive question, right? Why exactly does Aboriginal Australian DNA contain the highest concentration of ancient, non-human DNA anywhere on the planet? Well, to figure out that mystery, we kind of have to dismantle the tidy, comfortable little story that scientists rigidly believed for decades. It was a timeline built on limited tools and, honestly, quite a bit of hubris. For the longest time, the so-called single dispersal out of Africa model was treated as absolute gospel, but it made some really flawed assumptions. It assumed Aboriginal ancestors split from East Asian ancestors super late, like less than 35,000 years ago. It also assumed Australia was settled in one quick wave with absolutely zero ancient DNA in the mix, basically treating Aboriginal Australians as just a late branch on the East Asian family tree. The old idea was pretty simple. Humans left Africa, became East Asians, and then just sort of drifted south to Australia as an afterthought. But yeah, that neat little story? Completely wrong.
The very first major crack in that old model didn't actually come from genetics. It came from dirt, specifically a rock shelter in Australia's Northern Territory called Madjedbebe. Using this mind-blowing method called optically stimulated luminescence, which literally measures the exact time tiny grains of sand last saw sunlight, scientists proved humans were living there 65,000 years ago. Think about that. That is a massive course correction. It pushed the accepted timeline back by up to 25,000 years and totally changes the game on when our ancestors started exploring the globe.
And the thing is, they weren't just barely surviving out there. They were absolutely thriving with some incredibly advanced tech. I mean, while people over in Europe were still basically chipping away at rough flint, First Nations ancestors were already grinding and polishing these perfectly sharp stone hatchets. They were fitting them onto wooden handles and using complex grinding stones for food prep. We're talking 20,000 to 30,000 years ahead of Europe when it comes to this level of toolmaking. It shows an unbelievable mastery over their environment.
But hold on, because the story gets even crazier. To actually get to Australia 65,000 years ago, these ancestors had to cross Wallacea. That's a notoriously treacherous stretch of deep ocean separating Southeast Asia from Sahul, which was the ancient connected landmass of Australia and New Guinea. Making that trip wasn't a lucky accident. It required intense group planning and complex boat building to pull off 8 to 10 separate open ocean crossings, some stretching 70 to 90 kilometers, where you couldn't even see the other side. It's an epic maritime feat that experts used to think was just flat out impossible for Stone Age humans.
Now a quick detour, because careless science can sometimes cause some really messy problems. Back in 2001, a study confidently declared that ancient DNA from a famous remain known as Mungo Man represented a totally extinct separate human branch. Sadly, some people actually used that to question Aboriginal connections to the land. But, plot twist, a 2016 reality check revealed a pretty embarrassing truth. That 2001 sample? It was accidentally contaminated in the lab by 5 different modern European people. Once it was finally tested properly, the real data proved direct, undeniable ties to modern Aboriginal Australian haplogroup S2. The big takeaway here is that proper advanced testing completely validated the genuine, unbroken genetic continuity of Aboriginal Australians.
Okay, so jumping back to that massive 5 to 6% Denisovan signature in Aboriginal Australians. When you compare that to the tiny fraction like 0.1 to 0.2% found in East Asians, a huge mystery pops up. Denisovans were kind of the quiet, overlooked cousins in our human family tree. Most people outside of Africa carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA, right? But for Aboriginal Australians, this Denisovan cousin left behind 2 to 3 times more DNA than the famous Neanderthals ever did. So what exactly caused such a huge difference?
Well, to wrap our heads around why, we have to really picture the world our ancestors were walking into. Because, guys, it was not empty. As they were island hopping their way across Wallacea, they were entering a super crowded world. It was already shared by multiple other hominins, ancient human relatives and cousins who were fully adapted to those local environments. Our ancestors weren't just charting empty, lonely islands. They were literally stepping into a vibrant, populated, ancient landscape.
And that landscape was wild. They were sharing it with small-bodied species like Homo floresiensis over on the island of Flores and Homo luzonensis up in the Philippines, which had this bizarre mix of primitive and advanced traits. And right there alongside them were the Denisovans. These guys were incredibly adaptable. Their territory stretched all the way from freezing mountain caves in Tibet down to the sweltering, humid tropical islands right near Australia.
All of this completely rewrites our genetic timeline because the genome from that 1923 hair sample proved that Aboriginal ancestors left Africa in an entirely separate wave. They split from Eurasians between 62,000 and 75,000 years ago. Think about the timing on that. Meanwhile, Europeans and East Asians didn't even split from each other until tens of thousands of years later. It literally means the first navigators were out blazing trails across the globe while the rest of humanity's ancestors were still clustered together.
You can really see how this incredible history stacks up in distinct, massive layers. First, you've got that super early split from Eurasians. Second, there's that insanely brave open ocean crossing into Sahul. Third, a distinct split happens between Aboriginal and Papuan ancestors while Australia and New Guinea were still connected. Fourth, we see this period of deep isolation, where the center of Australia literally turned into a harsh Ice Age desert, cutting groups off from each other for millennia. And finally, the massive spread of the Pama-Nyungan language family across the entire continent. Every single layer adds so much richness to the human story.
And you know, that deep desert isolation I just mentioned, it had a profound effect. It's actually mind-blowing. But because of those tens of thousands of years separated by a brutal Ice Age desert, the genetic distance between two Aboriginal groups on the exact same continent, say the Southwest and the Northeast, is actually larger than the genetic distance between a modern European and an East Asian. I mean, the sheer scale of time and separation happening on that one single continent is just staggering.
Now, bringing it all back to that 5 to 6% Denisovan DNA, we have to realize this wasn't just some random genetic quirk. It was literal survival gear. We're talking about inheriting genes perfectly tuned for temperature regulation to survive freezing desert nights, genes for processing sugars into quick energy, enhanced immunity to fight off new tropical diseases, and extreme kidney water retention for surviving the driest deserts. Basically, they were inheriting a biological toolkit passed down from a completely different species that helped them master some of the harshest environments on Earth.
So how exactly did they get all this? Well, advanced genetic modeling recently revealed a huge twist. Our ancestors actually had two completely separate encounters. They didn't just meet the classic Denisovans we know from those freezing Siberian caves. Nope, they met a unique, highly specialized tropical branch of Denisovans that had been evolving entirely on their own for a whopping 280,000 years, right there in those islands. That tropical line is found almost nowhere else on Earth, which is absolute proof that our ancestors were living and interbreeding with them exactly as they passed through Wallacea on their way to Sahul.
What makes this deep genetic record so powerful for us today is that it offers undeniable proof of sovereign connection. You know, despite the horrors of colonization and 200 years of forced removals, modern indigenous-led genomic testing shows something beautiful. Groups like the Yolngu and Madjedbebe maintain a literal, unbroken genetic tie to their country. The group studied carry ancestral DNA with zero measurable recent European mixing. That tie to the land never broke. It is an absolute testament to their extraordinary resilience.
But honestly, the most beautiful takeaway from this entire explainer is that modern science didn't actually discover this timeline at all. It just finally caught up to it. Long before we had microscopes or genome sequencers, an unbroken chain of indigenous elders passed down oral traditions perfectly through ancient songlines. For millennia, coastal songlines have told vivid stories of the sea rising up and swallowing the land, which perfectly aligns with when geological records say the Bass and Torres Straits actually flooded. The knowledge keepers always have the timeline right. Ultimately, Aboriginal Australian DNA is a living, breathing record. It's woven from a species that isn't even Homo sapiens, and it's been carried forward for over 65,000 years by people who never stopped being there. So it leaves us with a pretty provocative question. If a dusty, 90-year-old lock of hair can completely shatter and rewrite human history, what other ghosts of our ancient past are still hiding in our DNA right now, just waiting to be found?